So I have a few questions. I wanted to start by um, talking a little bit about how the book came to be. And in a 2022 Brooklyn Rail interview with Doug Dreischman, you described how in an early art history class, you you felt an affinity to Smith's psychoanalytic tableau, to his obsession with the unconscious via Freud, to the intense ways in which his sculpture lived with struggle and war. And which makes perfect sense, given that your father was an abstract painter and abstract expressionist painter, and your mother was a psychotherapist. And you came of age during the 60s, in the 60s during the Vietnam War. Which of Smith's sculptures first spoke to you and why? And I'm wondering if there was a particular work or moment that made you realize the story needed to be told.
Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thanks for inviting us. Glad to be here. You know, my dad was a member of AAA, so long time ago. So this organization is I feel like this organization's in my blood somehow. And getting here early, coming to the village early, you know, just sitting out in Abingdon Square, which is the first when David Smith and Dorothy Dana got married in 2027. That's where they lived. So Smith was 21 then, Dana was 26. And the village, this particular neighborhood, was a part of their, really important part of their lives at an important moment in their lives. Okay, that course that you referred to, so I started graduate school in 1965, graduate school in art history. For a year and a half, the courses I took were pretty bread and butter art historical stuff, Gothic art, French art from 1400 to 1800, Italian, a year course in Italian Renaissance architecture. And my second year in graduate school, I took this course in modern sculpture, and people didn't teach contemporary and modern art then. It was very rare. And so it was a different world, and I'd been used to art historical languages, and suddenly there was a course where there really was no art history. So the languages that we were reading were the languages of art criticism and philosophy and literature, and it was much closer. They were much closer to the languages that made me care about art in the first place. And the teacher, Phoebe Stanton, was not a scholar of the field. She was a 19th century art historian, so she was learning the course really with us. And I met a lot of people there in that course who became essential to my life, Giacometti and David Smith being two of them. So, and the courses, Smith struck me right away. Giacometti was the one I got involved with. Smith never left my mind. And, you know, as Sharon mentioned in relation to this interview, I had a memory of these psychoanalytic tableaus. You can show the first slide. And it's very hard to, it's very hard to remember exactly what those images were. They were all, we didn't see works in person. They were all reproductions or slides. And so I'm trying, you know, to find images that somehow recall what it was that created this affinity with David Smith's works. And I can show you a couple. So this is Reliquary House. It was 1945, steel and bronze. There's some paint on it. In 1945, it was just out of the war. Smith had spent close to 3 years working in the American Locomotive Company, building tanks and weapons for the war. The war was over. It was a frantic moment for him. He knew that the world changed. He knew that art had changed, and he was really trying to figure out everything, what to make, and there was an introspective aspect to, a very strongly introspective aspect to his work. So I put up this work. It now seems to me so strange, you know, looking at it, even slightly absurd, but also marvelously made. And the sort of the handmade quality of the works of this moment, 1945 to 1950, seemed to me so vital and so interesting to think about now. It's about 1.5 feet tall, 2 feet wide. But what I wanted to call attention to here is simply the notion of a story, of some kind of narrative taking place. So these symbolic forms, the language itself, the figure lying down almost on a couch, and then these dream forms around it, all suggest that attachment to a psychoanalytic world that that was really part of his thinking then. And in other words, there's something here to be unraveled. There's something that a story or narrative, like a hint of something going on in the unconscious that needs some form of speech and needs some form of interpretation. Next image. So this is a canonical Smith. This is interior from 1937, and it's steel and cast iron. And this is the work that Clement Greenberg, that really blew Greenberg's mind and made him such an enthusiastic supporter of David Smith. He saw it in a group show in 1943, a really inconspicuous group show. And he went on to say, in relation to that, Smith is 36. If he's able to maintain the level set in the work he's already done, he has a chance of becoming one of the greatest of all American artists. And what he saw in this work, he talked about the house now being a viable subject for sculpture in the round. You know, it's worth knowing, some of you will probably ask, that was the year in the Dada Surrealist show at MoMA, the Giacometti's Palace at 4 a.m. was shown. So this was a work that came later in the year, and you know, clearly some response to it, but also moving in its own direction. But Greenberg was drawn most of all and commented on the formal energy. And it is sort of remarkable. He commented on the negative spaces of the work, the movement of the line, the sort of feeling for the metal, and a sort of impeccable and rare kind of energy in the work. And I can now see in the work that I've been very interested in. Smith's interested in writing and script and kind of scripture, and I really see it now that maybe it actually began here. But again, we have a hint of some kind of odd narrative. You've got the little baby form on the left, and then you've got the more maternal form next to that, and then you've got on the other side this odd form which we assume to be male but really don't know. And there's a real separation between them, and then there's these phantom-like images buried in the lines and in this really odd kind of structure. So again, it's just this sense of some story that's being implied, and something that's actually looking for a form of speech, some kind of drama. And when I think back of my experience of the Smith's work and that initial experience, and a real kind of tension because the figures are spread apart, but you know, this tremendous kind of handmade energy and dynamism in the making of the things that actually feels to me very contemporary in its own way. But it's part of what stayed with me and called to some kind of later involvement. Can you show the next image? So this is Home of the Welder. It's another canonical work, 1945, and I'm not going to say much about it because I think Becca's also going to refer to it. And you have another open structure. It reminds me in a way of the kind of insistence in thinking about Moholy-Nagy and other people at the time on transparency, because in Smith's work, everything is open. Nothing is hidden, but sort of everything is hidden. And you have a symbol language here too, with the nude on the wall and the millstone and the cross and the mast, and you know, symbolic language that he referred to, he wrote about to some degree. But it's again at this particular moment of Smith's work, this hint of a story, hint of a narrative, hint of something that he's trying to work out that's related to the pre-conscious or conscious, or something that's beginning to come into form that needs the attention of the viewer in some way.
Well, you know, the thing that I loved about your book was it had such remarkable detail about, you know, the whole time period, and then from every piece of correspondence and bit of a letter. But I have a question. The next question is about uh, when he went to, well, what really led to abstraction. And in 1931, Smith and his first wife, the artist Dorothy Diener, put all his belongings in storage and went to St. Thomas, where he hoped to get away from the influence of all the European modernists, Picasso, Cezanne, Matisse, and forge a new direction that reflected the unique American character. While in the islands, he became obsessed with photography, found objects, carving small figurative sculptures, and then ultimately combining different types of found materials in one sculptural piece. When he was back in the States, Smith took a job making bases for Frank Cronenshield's African art collection. Could you talk a little bit about how these experiences nudged him closer and closer to abstract approaches? And when did he begin to see himself and his work as uniquely American? And also, maybe you could just mention a little something about his joining the American Abstract Artist Group.
I think the question, I mean, there's a kind of sub-theme, maybe not even sub-theme, main theme running through our conversation, and that's Smith and abstraction. And even though everybody has talked about it, it's actually not written about that much. So what Beck and I are going to do, there's by no means an attempt to comprehensively deal with the issue, but I think there is some attempt to put issues on the table. So it's the beginning of a discussion, both for here and elsewhere. And the subject of abstraction is so important and so interesting. I think this question, when did he begin to see himself and his work as uniquely American? It's an important one because he really was never interested in that. And I think if you consider the beginnings of abstraction and beginnings of AAA, and you think about Stuart Davis in the 30s, the idea of being uniquely American was anathema to them. It was antithetical. It was something that they were vehemently opposed to. That one of the reasons they were drawn to abstraction, and I'm certainly talking about Smith at this point, was that it could be everything, and the whole world could be part of it. And Stuart Davis talked about that. I mean, Smith wrote an essay on abstract art in 1940, and he said in it, the tradition of our art is international as we are American people. As are American people, customs, and science. There's no true American art, and there's no true American mind. And abstraction was part of the modern movement. It was one way in which artists who were as political as Smith was could think about forms that were completely rooted in the past and also moving in some progressive notion into the present. And I think about abstraction then as both horizontal, meaning that what was going on in America through abstract artists was also connected with what was going on in Europe and France and what was going on all over the world, and also horizontal because it's by examining the language of art and the forms of art that these connections with art over time was established. So, as Meyer Shapiro made a point in his writing on abstraction, that a lot of these cultures whose work was thought about as monstrous in some ways now became part of a very large confraternity. So it was abstraction in a way, that form language that opened up the connection to art all over the world. And this cosmopolitanism, this anti-provincialism, which was so important to Smith, was definitely part of what drew him to abstraction. And the regionalists, the American scene painting, Stuart Davis hated this kind of work, that hated that notion of nationalism, and Smith was against that too. So it's all a way of saying that what drew Smith to abstraction, and there was a very broad view of abstraction that was supported by American abstract artists. It's in the yearbooks, the introduction to the yearbooks. It's wide open and kind of welcoming to everything, including surrealism.
Right.
All the various different kinds of abstract movement. So that's important to say with Smith, that abstraction could be everything. I don't know, I can keep going with the question you asked about the Virgin Islands and because it all and the role of all that and the development of Smith and abstraction. So in 1931, Smith and Dana went to the Virgin Islands for close to a year. Gauguin was the hero. I mean, they wanted to go to the other end of the world, but that was a little bit far away. So they took what they could get and went to St. Thomas and settled there for a great many months. And Smith had been working every day, various jobs, Spalding and Company, doing illustrations. So, and they were people who wanted to. They were very anti-materialist. They wanted to live off of their own resources. And in St. Thomas, they did. And then things just opened up for him. Like, could you go back to the previous image? So these are found objects. These are thought to be Smith's first sculptures, and they're made of coral. Obviously things that he discovered or just found walking on the beach, and then and made the forms out of them. One of them is you can see a kind of standing or running woman, and then the other one, the head. I think there's some doubt about which came first. I guess the assumption through Dorothy Dana is that it's the head, and not just a head, but it was painted, so that Smith's first work was first sculpture was already painting. That painting and sculpture went together in the beginning. But I feel always with Smith, you feel a kind of excitement in finding things, and then working with them. And there's even a kind of gentleness with which he uses found objects. He really doesn't. He very rarely imposes a kind of reality. He sees a kind of reality in it, and then he goes with it, and he brings it out. The next slide. So he also started to work with photography. He did photographs of many kinds in the Virgin Islands, including like documentary photographs. He had an idea of wanting to sell a journalistic series that would be called Uncle Sam Rapes the Virgins. Which is a sign of his particular kind of anti-colonialism in politics. But he also arranged these tableaus, which are kind of similar to the tableaus we've been looking at, and took photographs of them, and saw through photography that that whatever he was finding and putting together could have multiple identities and a kind of unstable. And there was an instability to identity in the forms that he was using. So anything could happen, and photography here became a really important part of his work. The next slide. Yeah, and another one. So there is a certain theatricality to these tableaus, which is again related to those sculptures, and a kind of surprise and interest in what could become of forms through photographing them. And he would play around with photography a lot. There's been a fair amount written recently on him in photography, but the full nature of what he did, the experimentation, is where it comes from. The second and third exposures. That's only begun to be understood. The next slide. So then he came back to the States in '32. They went up to Bolton Landing, and he had taken some forms with him from the Virgin Islands, and part of what he was interested in, we talk about abstraction, the invention. There's a combinatory intelligence in him. So this interest in combining objects from different places that's already here. So you've got the coral on top, who looks like some kind of figure from Aida, right? I mean, about to belt out an aria. And then the form itself, and it's so sort of peculiar and strange and interesting. And I see this almost as a kind of machine, like you've got these various aspects of it that look like they could be wound up. You'd like a music box, and and something would be set in motion. But there's always this enthusiasm in him and what he can find and what he can pull together that's unexpected in their combination and make something happen that hadn't existed before. So we're in 1932 now, and you could put up the next slide. And in 1933, one of his closest friends was John Graham, and I mean, there's so much to be said about Graham, but Graham was also someone who collected African art, and he brought art back, African art back for certain people in the United States. And in 1933, he made it possible for Smith to do a commission for Frank Crowninshield, who was the editor of had been the editor of Vanity Fair and was one of the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art, and he had a pretty fabulous collection of African art that had been gathered together in part by Graham. So Crowninshield commissioned Smith to make the bases for a couple of dozen, I'm not sure if we know exactly how many, African sculptures. And it's very hard to overestimate the importance of this commission, because it made it possible for him to understand how these sculptures worked. It made it possible for him, through his hands in some way, to understand the spirit of these works. And then he had these objects on the bases spread out in their apartment in Brooklyn, and which seems to me the first stage of the Fields later on, where he was surrounded by them. And then later on in 1933, which is such a crucial year, so that's when he really came across the welded steel sculpture of Gonzalez and Picasso, and which was an immense discovery for him. And then he began welding, and then by the end of the year, you have these sculptures. These kinds of masks, or these, this kind of use of found objects, and you're looking at them and as he photographed them in Bolton Landing, and what I feel in these sculptures looking at them is this extraordinary excitement about doing something, combining, taking this from here and that from there, and putting it together and making a face, and there was a kind of playfulness in it, a great kind of wit, and if you think about these sculptures in 1933, it's very hard to think about anything else in American art like them. There really isn't like anything else like them.
Michael, could you talk a little bit about the move from the sort of more figurative and found object sculpture to the Cubi series, and his move towards more geometric forms? And also, I'm wondering, was he at all involved with ideas that ultimately led to minimalism? I mean, he was clearly interested in form and wasn't quite as interested in the sort of emotion of the abstract expressionist painters. He was more interested in sort of psychology, memory, and so forth.
Well, I think the Abecs, they were certainly interested in those aspects. They were certainly also interested in the unconscious, very deeply. Can you put on the next slide? Okay. I think the minimalism question is an interesting one, because I think of Smith as so profoundly anti-minimalist that it almost seems to me that minimalism would have had to define itself partly in relation to him or against him. His work is relational. It's subjective. I mean, it's handmade. It's sort of defiantly anti-fabrication. There is a kind of journey there. It's something what you see is never what you see, and so I wanted to read this comment. Robert Murray was an abstract sculptor of the next generation, and And when I interviewed him, he said this. He said, I remember talking to Carl Andre one time at Max's Kansas City, and somehow Smith's name came up. He said he couldn't imagine doing sculpture like Smith because Smith did it so well. He was the godfather, so to speak, of sculpture as far as my generation was concerned. And I think this idea of Smith doing what he did as well as he did in such a way that it was really impossible for sculptors who were really ambitious to come after him. In a sense, they had to go in completely the opposite direction. That's kind of the point that I would make. So I wanted to show this famous image that Smith took of Australia. And if you think about this in relation to the earlier images that I showed you, the reliquary house, the home of the welder, there's a difference of 6 years between them, but it's like we're in a different century. And a different notion of sculpture, something has completely exploded. And if the reliquary house, we're in a world that can be maybe defined in terms of the language of dream. It seems to me here that we're in a language of hallucination. And the difference between dream and hallucination is a profound one. The hallucination being a much more radical term, a much more extreme term, or one that goes beyond subjectivity into the possibility of an immersion in a reality that's completely different from one's own. Yeah, let's go on to the next one then. I just wanted to show a couple of images that would raise the question of color and abstraction, because this is 5.5. This is 1956 to 1959. I think the connection with minimalism maybe would seem to be here. But these are all, to my knowledge, these are all like handmade forms, the blocks of steel. And if not, there's still a differentiation between them. And the rods that go up and connect them, it's not one rod, it's built from step to step to step to step. And then you've got you've got a hint of a kind of regularity of progression, and then that's really broken with the L-shaped form on the top, which maybe makes you think of that 1932 construction too. But the color is odd here because of there's a regularity and a kind of calmness also. I'm just talking subjectively for myself about the reds, and then you go into the green and yellow, and then what you've got up top is the various forms of green, and Smith talked later on about when he's talking about color, and he's talking about soothing color, and then he's talking about maybe finding something that's going to break all that, and perversity was the word he used, then finding something that would completely go against that. So that you get a hint here almost of an idol, maybe an idol maybe of a slightly desecrated one, or an idol that becomes a little bit absurd. And the last slide, and then so this is Beck Dita Day. This is 1963. Beck Dita refer to Rebecca and Candida Smith's daughters, refers to their birthday, which were celebrated when they were both up at Bolton Landing in August of each year. So it's a festive day. And one of the happiest days of the year for him and for their family. But I wanted to mention this because you've got the primary colors here, and I was reading an essay by Leger in the yearbook, the AAA yearbook in '46, and he's talking about color, and he's talking about liberated color. He's talking about color as a basically human need, and he's talking about color on its own and part of a whole discourse on liberation. And it just seems to me here, I raised the question that Smith was finding a way through sculptural form to actually make blue some kind of profound thing in itself. And if you would see it from the other side, which is yellow, which is also like a blast of color, you would get something very similar, so that color becomes its own almost physical reality. And the idea of working out a notion of color in relation to sculptural form, in relation to the tank top, the circle and the steel beam on top, so that the sculpture produces, liberates color, and the color in turn pushes back and reveals the strength and the particularity of sculptural form. I mean, to talk about color, there's so much going on in Smith in relation to what he's trying to do with color, but at least in these two works, I can raise a couple of ways of thinking about it.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in if I could with the
Yeah,
response.
yeah.
To just the whole question about abstraction. It's nice to be here with you abstractionists. I wondered first about my father, why he became an artist, given that he, grew up with I don't think he went to a museum until he was maybe 20 or something like that. And my conclusion was that it was really, he's had a sense that this was the place that you could really put everything that was being, because he came from a very provincial place, and that this was art was where he could put who he was, and identity was really important. There was a quote from Dorothy Daynor was a big clue. She said, she spoke of this terrible dichotomy in the life of big ego and no ego, big ego and squashed ego. I thought another clue was that when he first came to New York and he had barely even heard any music, he heard Stravinsky's Firebird Suite, and he later wrote, "Nothing has surprised me since." And I thought that was such an interesting response, because it was as if surprise, a complete break from what was known, was sort of 100% greeted by him. And I think that was the way, that was how modernism was for him too.
Well, you had said earlier when we were talking that that he encouraged you and your sister to become musicians.
Right. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think he really wanted us to be musicians. He picked out instruments for us, which ones we would play, and he took us for piano lessons very, very early. And I think it was because he really wanted the life of an artist for us, but he didn't want us to be, he wanted it in a more social art form where it wasn't the kind of lonely artist in the studio.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I could see that. Tell us a little bit about your, oh, wait a minute, I missed one.
Well, why don't we just, if
Yeah.
you want to look at these construction, this is the one before was construction in Bent Plains. That's 1936, and that's okay. And that's I think that's that's his real modernist abstract sculpture there. Things were getting more kind of pulled together. Can you show the next one? This is Objects Left at the Ironworks in Brooklyn, 1942. And to me, this feels like like Home of the Welder. This is a really autobiographical piece, but it's about the workshop and the studio, which was the same for him. And it refers to the place that he first was able to do welding at a blacksmith shop in Brooklyn. And when he left there, he took stuff from the floor, little pieces of bronze, and then like 10 years later made this sculpture. And I think it's such a beautiful, very, very finely crafted, fluid lyrical piece. So the next one,
Could you get the size of that, Becca, the one before?
yeah, I'd say like this. That one. It's quite small, and it's again an interior, but also connected to an exterior. And I think that looks like a fish. And it was this workshop was right on the Hudson River, and it it's again it's things are hinted, but you don't really see the full. Your eye just moves to the sort of the next thing. You could go to the next. So that's Home of the Welder. I wanted to just show that again in relation to the first one. This is more the psychology of the person. And this is in the context of thinking about abstraction. Next one. So I have three of these because I love this piece so much. It's Blackburn, Song of an Irish Blacksmith. He was one of the two who was in the blacksmith shop that I mentioned before. And this piece, I mean, now it's not. You can kind of see a head on it, but it's not a constructed building anymore. It's like when you could show the other two images. So that's it from the side. It looks like a different piece, right? And there's a big piece of bronze with a green patina on it, on sort of in the back there, and I think it looks like it's called Song of the Irish Blacksmith. It's like sculpture is music. It feels like an embrace, and it feels like a dance. And the last, is there one more? Yeah. So you see how that, I just have to say, that green piece is cantilever. It's acting as a cantilever, and the middle, the sort of spine of the piece is going into the edge of the circle on the base. So to actually balance this is kind of complex kind of thing. And the other thing about it I wanted to mention was that all around, even like that first reliquary piece, there are like little nodes of events going on, and they're very sort of active and mysterious, but there's all this rhythm. This was a very complex piece, and it's interesting too. The only two times that he names anyone, either their daughters or their blacksmiths. So you can see Leroy Borton at the Museum of Modern Art. He was another one.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your work? You're an artist.
Yeah, I'll just.
And my question is,
Yeah.
what would you say you take from your father, and what would you leave behind?
I guess, I think, I mean, I kept it at arm's length for a long time, but I really, the past maybe 10 years or something, these are my examples of abstraction. We're going to see. You can just keep playing them. This is a really abstract one. And that's a really super interesting piece because it's about looking through it. And it's really simple. It's stainless steel. And this is his, I think, I'm not sure whose photo it is actually. But to answer your question, I think the best thing I got from I spent a lot of time with the catalog raisonné and with the and talking to Michael about the biography, and our editor is here from the catalog raisonné, and I really immersed myself, which I always wanted. I didn't want to never not do that. Never not do that. And the thing that I got the most was really from him in the end was that the sense that he had about art as something that was this incredible place of possibility, and where you could really bring yourself, and also this connection. I loved what he said about the family of artists that was, that it makes time travel possible. So I think that, and that's the same piece that was outdoors. So this is my work that I'm doing now. I actually make this material. It's and I cast it. So this is like 5 pieces on some field stones and then a piece of felt. And this material I grow. It's wood. It's fiber that's bound together with fungus, and then the fungus dies, and it's cast in. And the forms I use are like hollow packaging materials, sometimes from nature, sometimes just something around the house. In this piece, it's called Common Language. It's the language of these holes and these, and that's how they all sort of came together. Sometimes I form. This is just other views. Sometimes I form them. I grow them together. I can sometimes or connect them in some way so that they're constructed. They're sort of constructions of these casts, and then sometimes I just put them. They're like little communities.
I'm also curious about your father and how he handled parenting. Parenting takes a huge amount of emotional effort, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, as a parent, well, first of all, he was a part-time parent, and he died when I was 11. So he didn't do the full thing, but he really liked kids, and he was really fun. He was, and he was, he sort of set things up for us, and we just kind of did our thing. He was. I wouldn't say he was strict. I mean, he was.
Can you describe one of the things he set up for you?
Well, he got us really great dress-up clothes from like a very eccentric woman. And so we had these like tons of dresses and outfits, and he also got all the uniforms from the high school marching band. So like this is the kind of thing
to be musicians.
Oh, right. So we well outfitted, yes. So, and then we had like a little boat for our pond, and we'd go, scamper around in gowns and jump in the boats and things like that. So, yeah.
Well, okay. And then I'm also curious, he died when you were quite young, and well, as you mentioned, when you were 11. And I'm wondering, I mean, has your relationship to his work changed over time?
Yeah, certainly, I mean, everything changes over time. So, but I guess it's always been sort of like a recognition. Sometimes, it's not, sometimes it's surprising to see things. It's like sort of like, seeing something familiar and sort of a friend. And I've always felt like those inscriptions were on the sculptures were really, a way like getting a postcard or something.
Right, because he would put you and your sister's names on the basis of the sculptures.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, I think we have time for some questions. If there are questions out there, did you want to talk about this?
This was just another example of an approach. And I think that there are a couple more. You could go to the next. So this, you can sort of see the figure in this. You could go to the next. And this one up, this is the last one. And I think you were going, if I were to see, I would love to see this piece again. It's in Texas. And it's called Q by 8. And it's really hard to see this flat. Is there another one? Did I mention another one? No. So this all reminded me, my sister and Michael Brenson and I were seeing this show that together. And we spent a long time looking at this and walking around it, because you really are compelled to walk around it. And it really reminded me of the three of us. And we're like in one spot, and we're looking out at the world from different perspectives. And it was, and I'm pretty sure I remember it in the fields. I think it definitely has that sentinel feeling.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Right. Questions, Kim?
Okay, so I had a question that pertained to the sculptures in nature. I know Fong Bui wrote in The Rail about that show at the Frederick Meyer Gardens in Sculpture Park recently. And I'm going to read what he said. Another thrilling aspect of this exhibit was the way it focused on the artist's unrelenting communion with both nature and the nature of his work, each inseparable from one another. Smith was constantly observant of how each of his sculptures punctuated and coalesced with the surrounding landscape. To me, they seem related, and I thought maybe the two of you could speak a bit to that point of the relationship of the work to nature.
I think it's hard. It just was always there. I think it was always there. I mean, when even the very earliest little photographs in the Virgin Islands of those tableaux, there was nature there. There was, not just the materials, but around it. And he referred to it a lot too.
Maybe in part, your question, Sharon, about the Virgin Islands to the Cubis, it's hard to answer that. But once you hit 1950, once you hit a sculpture like Australia, then the sculptures are no longer so much things just to look at. There are also things that function, that have a certain function in relation to the natural world or reality, that they take hold of the world around them. And I think the idea of nature is such a complicated and big one. And if you think about a sculpture like Australia, or the image of Australia and the way the sky comes through the work. I mean, in the Cubis, it kind of paints the work, right? But it comes through the work, and there's something in that Australia, the drawings in space, that has a cosmic quality about it, so that the relationship to the natural world, it's very detailed in the sense of being able to gauge and respond to what's happening on a micro level every single day. And then there's something really vast and reaching out for something like unnameable or very hard to put a finger on. And that's all part of the sculpture too, and that's all part of, I think, what we have to pull in and accommodate through a word like nature.
Can you get the mic over here?
Michael, I was fascinated by your discussion of the mid to late 40s works and the sort of interiority of them and their narrative dimension of them. And I just wondered if you see in the works of the 1950 on that start to engage with the landscape a sort of turn toward a more public presence for Smith in relation to the world.
When you say public,
Public facing as opposed to a more inward dimension.
Well, maybe that's also a little bit what I was referring to about kind of a way of functioning in relation to the space around it, the way it takes in and performs and actually does something in relation to people and the space. So that something can happen in a more public way. I agree. What Becca has to say about that work is kind of interesting to me, because maybe this sense almost of a family. In other words, there are ways in which the intimacy of the 40s work, maybe not so much the narrative, but the intimacy do continue to unfold and reveal themselves later on, but in very unexpected ways. And as you say, more a public way, because in a sense we become. It's not just we're looking at a kind of family situation or family drama. In a work like that, we actually become part of it. And what's going on in the sculpture asks for some participation from us that mirrors to some degree what's going on in the sculpture that goes beyond it. And maybe, that's a beginning of an answer to your notion of publicness.
Thank you.
I was just curious, thank you for being here. I was just curious from his earlier work and seeing the volume that he's erecting, would you say that his confidence is more solidified than when he was in earlier stage of his work, or is it just kind of coming out? I don't know.
Could you just repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, just looking at his various stages of his work, it just seems like he's growing more confident and it becomes more solidified. His confidence becomes more solidified as he becomes more solid in his work. I don't know what else to say, how to say.
Well, Paul Tucker wrote, do you remember that essay that he wrote for the Guggenheim retrospective, which was 79 or something? No, 2006.
Yeah.
He wrote that with the volume, and it's really true. I mean, with the cube eyes, the work got really volumetric. And that was like the first time. He wrote that after having a family and children, he became a different kind of person who kind of things got 3D. So it's an interesting idea.
I think the confidence, on some level, the confidence was always there, right? Like even when you look at those first choral pieces, there's a kind of willingness to go with his instincts and just do it and go for it. His notion of making art was a constant kind of self-surpassing. In that sense, maybe, Picasso was a beginning, something of a model for it. So he was always going beyond, and always pushing himself beyond where he was before. He didn't repeat himself. Almost uniquely of people of that generation. And every show that he had, there was some kind of internal pressure that he felt to do something that hadn't been done before, and to wow people in a way that hadn't been done before, so that there was a certain kind of magic to it. So I feel like the nature of the way he worked demanded a kind of confidence that would continue, and no matter what he was actually feeling inside, to do it more, to include more, to ramp up the scale and to some degree. And I feel like a little bit in relation to the cube eyes, because what Becca said is certainly right, and yet I feel that there something gets back to the minimalism question. They're not objects, and what's more, I think on some level he was undoing the object. That when you look at a sculpture like Australia or the objects in space, there was some sense that the object was the enemy. So when you get to the cube eye, and then you get these more volumetric forms, but they're also turning, they're hit by light, they're dematerialized, so that something is always happening, and even the solidity of the form is demanding something of him to move in the opposite direction. So there was something fundamental to the kind of conceptual framework of the work that demanded the supreme confidence, or even if he didn't feel the confidence, to actually go ahead and do it and push himself beyond where he was before.
I think thanks all three of you for being here. I love that phrase self-surpassing. It accounts for a lot and a lot of pressure that artists feel. but I wanted to ask about drawing. With respect, I had an experience with a sculptor whose name I can't remember. I think it might have been with the 2006 show, where I just had this realization that he handled a kind of projective perspective beautifully, and it was a sculpture that was around the same time as the Song of the Blacksmith. Um, and I keep feeling that this ability to walk around a cubi or to walk around the Song of the Blacksmith and see these different aspects that are accounted for in the construction of the work is a kind of projection of drawing. And my question is we know drawing was really important to him. And when did he get a hold of, you guys have any idea of when he got a hold of perspective, his control of perspective, his ability to sort of project into 3D, 3-point perspective? Because he has a kind of working schematic in his brain that's, to my mind, spectacular.
Well, when I hear that question, I'm thinking, you mean you mean having something flat and then projecting it all the way around.
Yeah, understand.
But that's how a 2D person would think. I mean, why would anyone, if you're like making.
But the aspect of drawing is there's still a kind of projection.
Well, he came out of a painting background.
Yeah.
He was a painter who became a sculptor. And that's why I think that, if I could just put that in here, that's why I think his sculptures his early ones were so much like drawings, especially the rooms. And, it was almost like it was a drawing that sprang to 3 dimensions.
Those are also occurring.
But Michael, you answer that.
The question of how his kind of 3-dimensionality gets imagined and carried out, it's such a key question and such a difficult one to answer. The way the 2-dimensional then gets transposed into something that, as Becca was showing with the Blackburn sculpture, is so profoundly different from point of view to point of view. It's a platitude that sculpture is 3-dimensional, and there are different views as you go around it. But there's nothing like Smith, in the sense that when Kraus said that you go from one to another, and it's like you're looking at a different sculpture. So how do you keep that in mind? How does that actually work so that you're doing it and you can visualize the whole thing, even as the points of view are so radically different and there's no transition, between them? That's kind of, the way I hear your question. There was the comment he made in a letter to Marion Willard, and he's talking about reading Joyce, and he said, where I have a tendency, like Joyce, to see objects in 6 different ways at once. And which suggests a particular personality too, that, a kind of radical shift, mercurial personality. But exactly how to answer your question and its relation to drawing, I feel like it's a profound one, and I don't completely know how to answer it.
Well, thank you all. We've come right up to where we're supposed to be. So that's good. Thank you, Michael and Becca, for joining us. Thank you. Thank you.